It does capture very little of what was expected out of the countries. But at the same time, there's been, and I'll only speak about the hoopla outside that journalists like me create or other people create in public sphere as compared to people like you actually talking in rooms seriously. There's been a lot of hoopla created about these deals, as Soumya was also pointing, and two of the elements that I noticed which were caught the eye of people who wanted to speak on climate change. One was that, oh, it came as a surprise. Bullshit. It wasn't surprise. It was in works for 3 or 4 years. Everyone knew it was coming. There was a lot of hoopla around the fact that China has finally committed something. Again, bullshit, because everyone knew China was going to commit a number in due time. Everyone also knows that India will also do the same, and so will other developing countries. There was no great expectation or change of expectations as if China has suddenly taken a U-turn. A clear indicator of that was that 10 days before the so-called US-China agreement, the Chinese meteorological department actually brought out, I think what it brings out biannually, called the Chinese Green Book, which produces data on emissions and says how we're doing. And it actually said we are going to peak by 2035. And it was in English. And most Chinese press reported it, except obviously one part of the world doesn't look at reportage in the rest part of the world, especially the yellow and the brown world. So it went amiss. And this has been true for climate change negotiations and climate change conversations for almost 5 to 7 years. Again, for some friends in India, and these are, I am not speaking of casual commentators, people like me, who just sit on the periphery, but people who've been negotiating for a while or have negotiated in these deals for a bit and at prominent positions like ministers and retired ministers. It was fallacious and idiotic at part, I would say, to comment about whether India should move away from China or should move close to US or otherwise. For 2 or 3 simple reasons, I'll give you evidence for that. On several occasions, India, US and China have actually worked together. A much clear example and very explicit example of that is actually the Copenhagen Accord. Much to the crying irritation of EU, the basic countries were actually negotiating with the US to come out with a Copenhagen deal, which, again, several people said has fallen apart because it was not accepted except for a political agreement in Copenhagen. But if you look at the framework of the 2015 Paris deal, it basically comes out of the Copenhagen Agreement. So several things that the US at that time asked for, and not only at that time, but way back in 2007 in Bali, when US joined back into the system and said, we want to negotiate, it set a certain parameter, set pieces of parameters and said, this is how we'll join in. And if you look back and see what they said in 2007 and what's happened by now, it's exactly how they placed it. Marginally left to 10% minus or 10, we've exactly got where the US wanted us to bring ourselves to. And for good reasons. One, they were coming late and they didn't want any action to be done on climate change in the first half of the century. They wanted most of the action to shift to the second half of the century. If you look at the targets that they're presenting now, and most countries are presenting now, we've literally achieved it. Most of the major action will now happen post 2050. US had its reasons saying that we were coming too late into the game. It was not fair to ask them to do much very quickly, as much as EU had done. Therefore, we should be asked to do much of it later. EU, even as it kept on commenting and pushing, saying, no, we are the leaders, slowly actually changed this game to actually come down to the common denominator that US had set the benchmark at. So by now, you actually see the climate leader is actually doing less in terms of percentage than it had done in the first 20, 30 years of climate change negotiations. It's also, after crying hoarse about a top-down agreement, the only country which is now talking about top-down agreement, as Indrajit was pointing out, is Bolivia, not EU. So, crying hoarse or not, they've all got onto the same bandwagon. Now, on several things, India and China and US do see eye to eye for different reasons. I think part of it is a real assessment that once US has set certain red lines, as we call them, or non-negotiables, there's very little you can do in diplomatic negotiations to push them to do it otherwise. Therefore, what do? You look for the best second option, which at times works to be actually sitting with the US rather than against it. A lot of other countries do the same. Several times, we've sat with the US to negotiate for what you think is a short-term economic security. Several times, we've sat with partners in the basic countries and argued against the US and EU. Several times, the basic itself has fallen apart, the clear example being South Africa itself, which has moved far closer to the center of EU politics rather than the basic country's politics. Very often, partners will come alive or come together with a certain degree of non-challenge about what the other partner is doing. So, say, take the case of the concentric circles proposition that Indrajit was talking of. It works in favor of Brazil because what is really perhaps asking for is incentives for red. And therefore it invites incentivization to move towards the inner circle. It doesn't work against India, it doesn't work greatly in our favor. So we are non-challenged partners sitting together saying, yes, perhaps let's talk about it. It's not as bad as complete breakdown of firewalls. There are occasions where, say, on loss and damage, India has come along very strongly with the rest of G77 countries, and in fact, partners of EU have broken away from EU to step in closer to the basic countries and argue for loss and damage, which is exactly what happened last time. Much to the, again, irritation of EU, you saw, and the US, you saw, even the AOSIS and LDCs and others all come together to make sure the loss and damage proposal comes through. Marginally broken down, but it did come through. So these grey images that exist in real climate change negotiations have very little to do with the images that we sell outside of these very simple binary ideas of are you against someone or are you with someone. I gave the analogy, and this is that came from a friend, saying this is not the war on terror. You're not on this side of the axis or that side of the axis. Each country, unfortunately or fortunately, is really just looking to preserve its short-term economic advantage. At times it does work to work together with one nation, at times it works perhaps to not work with one, and the third time it works to actually work against another nation. And each one of us, nation states, if I want to call them us, is doing that. Now, in that real politics, where is climate change? I would think, as the Indian term, which was referred to very often, it's a co-benefit at times. It just happens to happen at times that climate change also fits into the game and we're able to achieve a bit or two. Now, in this framework, to just substantiate these things, something that he pointed out to, the movement that US is making towards shale clearly is an energy security move that it's making, which will fit into, again, a long-term transition plan rather than a short-term plan. Again, if you look at numbers, the use of coal in the US continues to increase. It's not as if it's gone down suddenly. Even though it's pushing for it, in the short run, it's not going down. If you look at numbers from the Chinese economy, again, its per capita energy consumption is going to go up, not down. If you're going to look at the IPCC report itself, it does not talk about a scenario where per capita energy consumption of countries goes down. It actually presumes that we can increase per capita energy consumption and yet de-link ourselves. So if you wanted to use an ethical basis, saying what's the ethical basis of having, as he was talking about, a carbon budget, you would also talk about, do countries need to actually reduce their per capita oil consumption, coal consumption, and energy consumption at large? That is not even on the table. So a sense of ethics on the table of negotiations do not exist. What really does exist is real politics. And I keep suggesting to friends in the civil society to be a bit more cynical like a journalist at times and look at these negotiations for what they are and then think about what you want them to be and admit to the fact that there is a large gap between the two. Very often, I see the moment the US-China agreement announcement was made, several civil society organizations came and said, oh, there's nothing much that's happened, but it's very good, we must keep on encouraging them. And I kept on saying, so we must encourage them to do what? More or less? And why are we putting out these statements? So each of the civil society groups and each of us as individuals, we have our own biased vested interest in what we are selling, why we're selling. I keep hearing as a journalist, and I can say this, most of you guys can't, there are a lot of civil society organizations, depending on their source of origin, will also say, let's play down this, let's not talk about this too negatively at the moment. You know, we're beginning to encourage these people. It's as if really in last 10 years we've got anything out of them. I mean, this is across the board, whether it's India, China, US, or any other country. So it's an inherent, inbuilt, I would say, a sense of ego in the civil society which makes it believe that if you speak a bit less, you might encourage a certain country. If you speak a bit more, you might encourage another country. The negotiations, at least as far as I've seen and most diplomats see it, really don't go that way. Civil society really sits on the periphery, engages with it, believing it's more important than it is. A sense of realism about just point factually saying this is what's happening, I think would help a lot for the civil society to also have a greater influence in these things. I think a bit of that miasma that's created needs to be broken down. Couple of more points before I shut down. I have three more minutes. Thank you. This is, as Soumya and I think Agus also pointed out, and Indrajit more, I think, while you read IPCC and you read the science in it, very often for me as a journalist, and I think for a lot of diplomats, what's more important is what never found place in the IPCC. And that's what plays really in the negotiations. Very little of the science, unfortunately or fortunately, plays. So we will have an emission gaps report by UNEP, I think, day after or something. And we will again have a complete missing chapter on how the burden of equity distribution should happen. We also need to be careful about the way we use our words. There is a huge difference between implementing equity, implementing fairness, and implementing justice. All of these imply politically and under international negotiations very different consequences for different nations. There's a reason why Africa uses justice. There's a reason why India uses equity. There's a reason why some other countries, developing countries and Europe, uses fairness. What it means as responsibilities, and these are economic costs involved. The other point which I wanted to make, because I spoke of cost, was it's rather naive to believe, and I think again it's verging on dangerous to claim that climate change is a win-win game. It's lemon sold by a lot of people to others, saying climate change is a win-win game. Really, in life and in economics, if someone wins, there is someone who's paying the cost in the short run, even if he gains it in the long run. So if you are saying that there will be jobs created in the green sector, yes, there is also a large amount of capital investment needs to be made, which does mean diverting capital costs at the moment from certain points to other points. So in the short run, some countries will gain a lot. In short run, some countries will lose a lot. In the long run, all these scenarios will change. Now, to take a gross figure and say overall 2 million jobs will be created. Again, if you read stories from across the US, you'll find that's what are called the cold cities of US at the moment are going through huge recession. The parliamentarians there or the Congress members from those cities are really facing a huge difficulty in figuring out, even if it's just 600 jobs, because their population densities are low, those are 600 jobs which really matter for the congressmen from US in a certain district. So there will be pockets where you'll see large transitions if we move away. Again, if we're moving towards renewable in India, we do notice that while renewable costs are going down, we're also giving a huge subsidy again to renewable sector as much as we're giving to coal sector, because land and water is relatively free at the moment for the solar sector. If we are doing concentrated solar over the next 10 years, we'll see a large amount of land and water intensively being diverted towards that sector. There is inherent subsidies in what we do. Again, the entire solar mission, if you remember when we did it in 2008, was built on the edifice of a 95,000 crore subsidy to be given up to 2035. And it ran through a 3-day process of negotiations back and forth, and it was eventually scaled down. The subsidy was hidden by creating a bundling mechanism through, I think, NTPC created, there was a separate firm created to ensure that it was never seen as a subsidy, but it was seen as a financial mechanism. But literally we were bundling renewable energy with coal sector to price it well and hide the subsidy, because in our budget deficit numbers, we didn't want to show that subsidy. So there are costs involved across the sector. Last thing before I shut off and let more, I guess, the superficial people speak on this. It's funny when you sit inside these negotiations and you see countries operate and see such sophistication on behalf of such small countries and the lack of capacity. Say India's condition itself. We claim we're a large economy. We've got, last time I think we had about 14 negotiators sitting at the negotiations, where at least on some days there were almost 30 rooms open for negotiations and people running between different nations. Very often you would find that countries which have common spaces would ask another partner country to negotiate on your behalf, because you surely don't have the capacity. It's worse for countries from Africa. To believe that these negotiations run on such binary modes as us against them is fooling ourselves, is thinking too little of what the negotiations are, and thinking too little of actually what the diplomats do at these places. It's perhaps the most complex economic negotiations that the world has ever tried. It's using a language which is of environment, but really this is a negotiation of economic priorities. And I think we belittle it if we kind of run it down into, will we sit tomorrow with China or will we day after have breakfast with the US? It's really a naive way of seeing the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin. Negotiation of economic priorities. I think in a way you have shared with us the politics of, climate negotiations and how far they are from the ethical dimensions that we all, want to see happening. And in a sense, it's rather depressing to look at the real politic aspect of it. But thank you very much.
Journalists are cynics.
Thank you very much for your insights into this. We have now one more speaker, Sudhir Sharma, who is not present with us because he is based in Copenhagen. And I think either Ajita or Sanjay. Sanjay, you're getting us in touch with him?
Huh? Okay, I need some help with this laptop to increase the volume.
In the meanwhile, if there are any reflections, because we are not going to have time for reflections, from the floor, it would be great if, if there might be some questions or clarifications.
With your permission, could I just add one thing, I think, to sum it up? For those again who might be suddenly surprised that India might put a number, India is expected to put a number. There's a set of studies they're conducting, I think, which will complete by December end. Now, like the previous time, they could prejudge it and already come out with a number like they did previously when Jairam Ramesh was the minister. But ideally, if they went by those studies, December is when they get 3 studies together looking at emission peak. And I think they're expecting between March and June to make a submission. It will be much higher, I'm very clear, and so are most people who know this game, that it will be much higher than what it is at the moment. Will it be different from what the US-China trajectory is? Certainly not. Or as much as we might demand otherwise, it seems to be that if you remember the 2008-9 projections we had done, we were looking at India peaking between 2040, 2045. China was looking at peaking between 2030, 2035. So if we went by what the US-China dialogue is, we are roughly saying we shall do business as usual just as the rest of the world.
Thanks. Any reflections, any questions?
I do have a question to a journalist who is more closer than NGOs who are sitting on periphery. Nitin, would like to know your views about this 100 gigawatt solar power being discussed by 2022. So